Hello, students. Welcome to my first remote lecture, my first attempt at remote teaching. It really is my first attempt because this is actually the first lecture that I am recording for any of my classes. All right, so think I have a good system set up here. I am going to start my PowerPoint, and you should be able to both see my face, hear my voice, and then also see my screen here. Although I suppose we will find out once this video ends and I actually get a chance to review it. Okay, so we're covering race and ethnicity this week. We are doing so in an extremely untraditional manner. In the way of announcements, everybody should have received both my updated syllabus and my email where I detail the changes that I have made to the course. What you see here is generally what you're going to get, right? I'm going to try and run my class as I normally would. And this does put a little bit extra pressure on you, right? It does put a little bit extra responsibility on you to work around the constraints here. I'm not going to be doing live classes. I certainly am able to talk to you live either on Skype or over the phone or whatever. But nevertheless, understand that you are being asked to really take responsibility for your learning here. If there are any questions at all, I am available to you, and I certainly hope that you will be willing to take advantage of that. We're all learning, but I think on very short notice, this is going to go okay. I really do. I think this is, not only is this the best I could do on short notice, I actually am pretty optimistic about this considering the circumstances because it's weird. There's a lot of that going around. Okay, so covering race and ethnicity this week. Similar to when we covered gender, I want to draw a distinction between those two things. I want to draw a distinction between race and ethnicity, similar to what I did with sex and gender. So here's what I will be covering in this particular presentation. I'm going to start by introducing, well, actually, that's a little bit out of order. I'm going to start by introducing the concepts of race and ethnicity, and then I am going to run through the demographics of the United States. We'll get a sense of how common certain groups really are. We'll get a sense of the terminology, and then I want to touch briefly upon identification and the concept of racial stratification, racial inequality. That will lead very nicely into the lecture that I will be posting for Wednesday. Okay, so let's get going with the concepts. I said previously that I wanted to make this distinction between sex and gender and make that as explicit as I can. Here, we're going to see the same type of overlap, but with some separate manifestations that need to be theorized about. Race is a concept that we describe as a group of people, it has to be group level, that share similar physiological characteristics, okay? So physiological, it's at the level of what you see, it's at the level of the expression of genes, although don't get too carried away with that because as we're going to see, the genetic basis for the racial categories that we have constructed is a bit tenuous. But nevertheless, this is how we sort people on race. We look at things like skin complexion, we look at hair texture, right? We look at those things and make judgments about what groups people fall into. Okay, so the common racial groups you've likely heard of, we have what, at least in the United States, we have white, we have black, we have Asian, so on and so forth. Hispanic Latino is something of a different designation. I am going to get to that in a little bit, but to give you a bit of a preview of that, the concept of ethnicity refers to a common or shared culture and heritage. So one is at the level of appearance, and the second is at the level of cultural expression. So in the same way that I encourage you to think about sex and gender is like, all right, sex is the biological identity and gender is the way of acting associated with that biological identity. We have a similar thing here. Now, as you probably can see, this is clearly leading towards a discussion in which I claim that race and ethnicity, especially ethnicity, are social constructions. They really have very little meaning outside of what society gives it. However, almost anything that we don't have control over is often something that people claim a real sense of ownership over. It's a bit of a paradox, but I do get it. If we were going to be meeting normally for our normal sort of lesson, I would show a video from the great and the late great stand-up comic George Carlin, where he talks about ethnic pride, right? And he goes to this whole story about how he's growing up, and on St. Patrick's Day, there's this huge parade, and everybody wears a pin that says "Proud to be Irish," right? And then all of a sudden comes Columbus Day, and all the Italians wear a pin that says "Proud to be Italian." And then all of a sudden we get Black pride and Puerto Rican pride and Dominican pride and so on and so forth. These are not things that people have a tremendous amount of control over. It's generally what you were born as, but maybe that's why we feel such a sense of pride over it. And, the video gets very amusing. You can Google it. If you just Google George Carlin ethnic pride, you'll be able to see this. It has this amusing take about pride should be reserved for something that you accomplished yourself, not an accident of birth, not a genetic accident, right? You wouldn't say I'm proud to be 5'11". You wouldn't say I'm proud to have a genetic predisposition to prostate cancer. And yet he argues that that's kind of at the same level. Okay. I would disagree. I mean, I think it's a very amusing statement, but I would disagree a bit. I would say that even though race and ethnicity are social constructions, they are things that influence our lives dramatically. Okay. So don't misunderstand my argument. They do influence our lives dramatically. And that's because if something is believed to be true, and if it is perceived to be true, then it is true in its effect on individuals. And these categories have to be both defined through interaction and maintained through interaction. We need to be able to look at racial or ethnic groups and immediately be able to use that as a category for what to expect from people, okay? That is not always fair. In fact, often it's completely unfair. But I do think there's little doubt that that does occur at the level of day-to-day society, okay? Pause for a minute, let you finish writing. So let's think about the demography then. Demography, as I have said many times, is the study of human population. Using the most recent data that I'm able to get, the 2019 American Community Survey at the national level, here is what the country's breakdown looks like. And one thing that I always find amusing is, like, I try to, if I'm giving an in-person lecture, I often ask people just to take guesses, write down guesses. What percentage of the country is white? What percentage of the country is Hispanic or Latino? What percentage of the country is Black, African American, so on and so forth. And people's judgment of this, people's guesses are often pretty far off. In fact, people tend to far overestimate the white population and tend to underestimate the Hispanic Latino population. Black population is usually actually the closest to what people perceive it. It's usually actually closest to what it actually is. 61.5% of Americans are classified as white. Okay, that would be white, non-Hispanic. I'll get to that distinction in just a second. 17.7% identifies as either Hispanic or Latino. Lots of overlap between those two things, but there is a meaningful and crucial distinction. 12.7% classify themselves as Black or African American, 5.5% Asian, and a little bit less than 1% identifies as American Indian. If you whip out your calculator and do the math on that, you will see that these numbers sum to 109.6%, which, speaking as somebody who teaches math and teaches statistics every year, that seems to break the rules of everything we think we know about percentages. How on earth did we get to 109.6%? Here's why. Hispanic and Latino, these things are not actually races. I do understand that many Hispanics are identifying most strongly with that designation, but Hispanic Latino, that is an ethnicity, and it is an ethnicity that crosses racial categories. Okay, so you can have white Hispanics, you can have Black Hispanics, and you can have everything in between, right? Mixed racial Hispanics. So since Hispanic Latino is not a race, it kind of acts as a race, but that is something that can cross category, that crosses categories. So if you take that Hispanic Latino designation, there is some number of people who would classify as both Hispanic and white, Hispanic and Black, in some rare cases, Hispanic and Asian. Okay. And you can very much see this just by looking around you. It's kind of amazing to me how very quietly, very naturally, Hispanic Latino has kind of evolved into a type of racial identity when really it's a cross-racial designation. Turn on Telemundo and you will see Mexicans, right? You will see Mexican Latinos who look exactly like me, right? Light hair, blonde eyes, look as white as I do, as Caucasian as I do. And if you turn on a baseball game, if and when that stuff ever gets plays again, right, especially Cubans, you will see some very black Cubans that are very clearly Latinos, okay? So that leads me to my next point, which is what is the difference here? I previewed this a little bit. What is the difference between Hispanic and Latino? Again, these are often designations that are used interchangeably. I want to try to put a stop to that and encourage you to see that there is some overlap. Nevertheless, we do have to take the differences seriously. Okay, so Hispanic refers to anybody, any individual with ancestry from a Spanish-speaking country, of which there are many. Latino or Latinx refers to ancestry from a Latin American country. So one refers to culture, like linguistic heritage. The other refers to geography, because Latin America refers to Mexico all the way down to the southern tip of Chile. Okay. Hispanic then is derived from the term Hispania, which was actually the term that the Roman Empire almost 2,000 years ago used for the Iberian Peninsula, which today is the present-day home of both Spain and Portugal. Latino is derived from Latin American, and as I've said, that is something that can include both white Latinos and black Latinos. Hispanic is something that has actually only been in the census since 1980. It closely corresponds with increases in the Hispanic population within the territorial borders of the United States, whereas Latino is used to kind of informally differentiate. It generally is meant, Latino is something that was kind of an informal designation. It actually doesn't appear in the census, although you can get at it because if you know what are Latin American countries, you can easily just code for a designation of Latino. The general reason why this was done is because it was something that the country wanted to kind of very informally differentiate between Spanish speakers from Spain, right? European Spanish speakers and Spanish speakers from Latin America. And the reason why that was done really should not be very difficult to understand. Hispanic, and Latino, we also see a kind of a pretty clear distinction in terms of where it's used, although these are starting to bleed together. Hispanic is a term that's most commonly used in New York, Florida, and Texas, right? Three states that have pretty large Hispanic populations. But if you look at New York and Florida, the Hispanic population there is generally from like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, places like that, Cuba, Spanish-speaking island countries, whereas Texas's Hispanic population is most commonly from Mexico, although lately also Central America as well, like Guatemala, Honduras, so on and so forth, El Salvador as well. Latino seems to be mostly used on the West Coast, although that is, again, as I've said, starting to change. So I'll pause for a second, let you guys get caught up. I'm giving this lecture live from my office on a Sunday afternoon. I should have probably said that up front. Working on the weekend. Some lectures will be filmed from my apartment, but this one, as you can see in the background, this one is being done in my office. Okay, so moving on here. If race is a social construction, then that means society can construct it differently depending on what their priorities are. We have seen this many times throughout history. So for example, Anybody today in the United States who would say that their ethnic heritage is Irish, Italian, or Slavic, and that does include Poland as well, even though if you ever call a Polish person Slavic, they just completely fly off the handle, even though it's a Slavic language that Poles generally speak. Those are groups that upon their earlier immigration to the United States, those were groups that were originally considered to be non-white, right? The Irish were considered non-white immigrants. Italians were considered non-white immigrants, mostly because of the Catholic thing, right? Mostly because of the Catholic heritage. It differed from the kind of English Protestant nature of many immigrants who had come a century before that. Mexicans before 1930, Mexicans were all considered white. From 1930 onward, they were no longer considered white. And then with the introduction of Hispanic to the census in 1980, Mexicans were now all of a sudden considered white or non-white, depending on their own claiming of the title, their own self-identification of it. The Japanese as well, believe it or not, the Japanese up to 1933 were considered white. They were. And then that privilege got yanked away, mostly because the writing kind of was seen on the wall that this was a group that the United States might have to fight a war against at a later point. And some believed, and some historians argue, that it would have been easier for the country to fight a war, a very destructive and bloody war against a non-white population. I'm a little bit skeptical of that argument because, like, one of the other major enemies during World War II was Germany, right? An extremely white population, an extremely European population. So I wouldn't take that too far away, but you should know that is what some historians argue. Black or African American, this is a very interesting historical thing. The characterization of Black has changed many times throughout the country's history. At various times, being 1/4 Black was enough to be considered Black entirely. Then it became 1/16. Then there was the 1-drop rule and the 1% rule. Oh, let me go back, pardon me. And the 1% rule. And this is something that's still with us to a degree, right? Because now people are claiming much more ownership over their own racial or ethnic heritage. I remember back in the 2008 presidential election, there was a big discussion about Obama. Is Obama Black because he was half white and half Black? So does that make him Black? Yeah. I mean, yes, of course it does. But that was something that was discussed sort of ad nauseum during that time frame. So right now we're seeing a kind of similar othering start to occur for people from the MENA region. If I haven't said this before in class, the MENA region stands for Middle East and North Africa. It is a group of countries that have historically always been considered white, right? The Middle Eastern, North African population has always been considered white. But there is a big difference that took on real meaning after 2001. And that's the fact that the population there is largely Muslim. So anybody who traces their heritage back to Muslim parts of Lebanon or Syria, Algeria, these are groups that have always been considered white and are now not really being considered white by the broader population. And that has effects. It leads people to kind of other themselves. So back in 2013, there was a proposal to add to the census a kind of Muslim ethnicity designation, which was surprising, except maybe not really. It seemed surprising at first because last I checked, religion is not racial, right? Which God you choose to believe in and how you choose to practice your religion, that is not a racial that is not a racial thing, but it might be an ethnic thing because it is such an intimate part of culture. So in 2013, the idea was to make this an ethnicity that you could claim on the census. So we had a better sense of what the population looked like. The best estimate right now is that about 1% of America is 1% of America is Muslim. It's growing, but but it is growing pretty slowly, a lot slower than people tend to realize. And then, of course, something happened that nobody could have foreseen in 2013, which was that Donald Trump became the president in 2016. And that just put the whole thing on hold, because based on some of the rhetoric, based on many of the things that have been said, if this is a group that you fall into, would you want a government document identifying you as Muslim, either religiously or ethnically, and listing your address? Like, I personally just would not want that. So generally, census experts believe that it would be a question that generated so much non-response that it just would be unusable at that point. So ethnicity, because it's generally linked to cultural practices, remains a bit more stable than race, but even that is something that can change over time. We've seen this with a lot of white ethnic groups, where a century ago, being white Irish in a place like Boston or Philadelphia was an extremely important thing for predicting your life outcomes. And now, I think those people are just white, like I'm ethnically German. That doesn't really mean a lot for my life chances. At this point, it means I like some types of German food and German cookies and cakes because I remember my grandmother from Bremen, Germany, making them for me when I was a little kid. And that's kind of as far as it goes. So even though we don't always lose our ethnic heritage, the meaning of it for our life chances can erode as groups are assimilated or as groups are othered. Okay. But what this is clearly moving towards is I have really stressed race and ethnicity to be a social construction. And that means it can obviously change, and not just throughout history, not just as our political and economic priorities shift. It's also something that can change if we go to other countries, if we go to other situations, if we go to another culture, we can easily see another designation or another understanding of race. So as an example, here is some copy and paste jobs that I did for censuses from other countries. So if I look at the Brazilian census, I can see that my race, right, the race I can pick is either white, black, yellow, brown, native, or undeclared. Good survey methodology for putting in the undeclared option or the other option. Always good to give people that choice. Now you look at South African and I see black African, I see colored, I see Indian or Asian, and I see white, right? So these are not things that are going to be used the same way in the United States. If I look over at England, the 2001 census from England, I can choose white British, I can choose white Irish, which in the United States probably has very little meaning in the sense of trying to understand the racial background of the population, but that shit goes back deep in the UK, right? The white Irish, white British thing is a big deal politically, specifically as it relates to Northern Ireland and all the violence that has occurred there throughout history. You can list mixed, Asian or Asian British, and of course the things that mean the most to the UK are Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi backgrounds, specifically because that's where there's so much colonial heritage. When it comes to Black British, Caribbean, Jamaican, right, parts of the country that parts of the British nation, so to speak, that reference some of these Caribbean island nations that were under British control for so long. You look at Mexico and you can see that there's an indigenous ethnic designation that's very, very important to understanding the well-being of Mexicans. I just look at these numbers here, or not numbers, pardon me. I look at these designations, and much of this doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's because I come from the majority group within the country that I was born in and that I have always lived in. So we have to give biology a social meaning. Yeah, racial designations are something that you can sometimes see with your eyes, but it's the social assumptions underpinning that is what is most useful to us. Okay, so moving on. One final example on this. Back in my last year of grad school, I applied for a job in the United Kingdom. And I took a picture of this because it was the first time that anything of the sort like this had ever happened to me. All right. And so I had to fill out all the demographics thing. What is your background? Blah, 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 blah. The idea, I mean, I wasn't trying to flee the United States or anything. It was just that my research, my dissertation had dealt heavily with Europe and the European social movement context. And what this led to a situation where I had absolutely no notoriety in the sociological community in the United States. And I had a very minor amount of notoriety. Like people were reading a little bit of my stuff and citing it very moderately over in Europe. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should try to leverage that. Maybe I will try to apply for a job in the UK or somewhere, just try to make a life for myself in Europe. So I looked at this, and clearly I'm white. If I go to Europe, I don't think that's going to change. But I go down here to, well, I'm not white British. I'm not white Irish. That definitely doesn't really describe my situation. So other white background. Wow, I never got to be an other before. Thanks, guys. Now, the point here I think should be very clear is because I come from the majority group within my country, I had to literally change the country that I was proposing to live in order to acquire a different designation. Okay. And it's worth keeping that in mind about kind of what it feels like to be an other or to be something that's unlabeled within your home country, right? Because that's not something that I've personally ever had to really deal with, right? I've thought about it. I mean, it's always known about it since I took sociology classes, but it's not something that's ever really affected me all that much until, of course, I go to try to apply for a job in Europe, and all of a sudden, now you're an other. Okay, so I think I've made the point pretty clear here. We do interpret race and we interpret ethnicity based on our own social conditions. Yeah, these things exist, but it's ultimately very, very difficult to sort on appearance. Now, one of the tragedies of all this online instruction that has to be done is as I go through this, I don't get to play some of the games that I wanted to play with the class the rest of the way. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to close out my PowerPoint just for 1 second, and I would like to pull up this, and we'll just run through this very, very briefly. This is a sorting game. I just argued that it's difficult to sort on appearance, but what if we actually did try? So what I was going to do, the plan for Monday was going to be, I would pull this up and we as a class would all vote on each one of these people. Is this person American Indian, Asian, white, Black, or Hispanic Latino? It's usually a very fun activity. So this person, American Indian, I don't know. What about this guy? We have to make a knee-jerk reaction. Well, why do I make students make an impulse decision or knee-jerk decision? That's generally how we deal with people we meet on a day-to-day basis. So I don't really know, but that guy just became Black. How about this young woman? I'm not going to go through this whole thing because I don't have the audience to really go off of, and it's a little, something is moderately lost there. But when I look at this woman, I guess I'm going to make that woman white. And I promise I don't know the answers here. I don't remember who goes where. We'll just run through a few more of these. Look at this woman. I don't know, maybe make her Hispanic. This gentleman right here, nice smile on that guy. Asian, I guess. I don't know. Like you can kind of see me going through this. Now that I've gotten one in each category, I'm just going to click next and oh, not yet. I must sort. All right. So the idea here, as you can see, is I always run through this with the class about we all have to kind of come to a consensus. Majority will rule in circumstances where we cannot unanimously agree, and we almost never can unanimously agree. But generally, out of the 20 individuals that you see here, by and large, we almost always end up with maybe 6 correct or 7 correct. 7's a good one. So I sometimes think about race and ethnicity. I will go back to my PowerPoint here. So a couple things, like we talk about race as if it is this concrete thing, as if it is this thing that is all encompassing. And then I just think of 2 very, very simple realities. First of which is most people don't even really know what percentage of the United States falls into what category. If we can't even get the most basic measure of demography correct, I wonder how stable any of this can really be. And then secondly, when we're trying to sort people by appearance and we do such a bad job on that, I'm even more convinced. How stable can any of this really be? Okay, so moving on here. What I really want to accomplish with this whole week on race ethnicity is not to just talk about, hey, race is a social construction. Hey, ethnicity is a social construction. Don't you get it? Your life has absolutely no meaning. No, that might be true in like kind of an existential sense. But as I said at the start of this lecture, if something is believed to be true if it's true in its perceptions, then it is also true in its effects on people. So race matters because it creates what's known as minority groups. Okay, so minority groups, this is not the same as just saying a numerical minority, although that is sometimes implied. It is usually the majority racial or ethnic or religious group in a society that tends to have the ability to make decisions. It tends to be able to marshal more power in a democratic situation. We do have some situations where a minority group is able to exert tremendous power and oppression over a majority group. We have seen that throughout history and in a contemporary way. Good example of that would be the white states of South Africa, the apartheid era South Africa, and the apartheid era Rhodesia. If you've never heard of Rhodesia, you can Google it. It's a country that doesn't exist anymore today. It is now called Zimbabwe. But these were situations where a small number of whites exerted tremendous political power over indigenous blacks within those societies. So we do see this sometimes. Another more recent example of this would be pre-Civil War Syria. So in Syria, all political power was controlled by a minority religious sect called the Alawites, who were only comprising about 8% of the Syrian population, but they had the presidency, they had the entire government, they had everything at their disposal. And when you think about decades and decades of that, it's not hard to see why various types of dissension started to arise throughout the Syrian regime. Okay, so minority group is not just numeric, it's also about power. And generally what we see is minority groups are groups who inhabit an unequal social situation. They do not receive the same level of institutional treatment. They do not receive the same level of resources at the local or national level. And this is compared to the dominant group within society due to their physical or the cultural characteristics. So you are sorted into a minority group either based on physical, racial traits or cultural characteristics, like what sect of Islam you happen to be in the case of Syria that I just gave. So again, as I've said, it's not just a demographic measure. It is something that has to account for power. It is something that has to account for status, and it has to account for the influence that people have to change these things, right? It's easy to say that, oh, well, if you're the dominant population, you should be able to be the dominant group within the country. And I would just remind you, that might be democratic in the broadest sense of the term, but it's not very democratic in a moral sense of the term, where groups will be protected, where everybody has the same treatment under the law. And that is where the concept of minority groups becomes very important. Minority groups, and you can see the graph that I have here, it's the percent of Europe, each country, the percent of Europe that is foreign born, because this is becoming a very tense third rail in European politics and society. One of the things that I do respect about the United States is this is generally one of the only countries that by and large takes diversity for granted. Like, we take it for granted that it exists. That is not the case in Poland, for example, or the Czech Republic. I feel like I could live for years in Poland without seeing someone who didn't look exactly like me. And then you look at the data and realize, hey, that's not my imagination at all. Like, I'm able to look at the data and see that 98.5% of Poland is white Polish, white Catholic Polish. It's just a very homogenous society. So in order for this to have meaning, minority groups have to be distinguishable. We have to know who belongs to what group. They have to be denied full social participation, right? We have to be able to see things like educational inequality, inequality in the criminal justice system, inequality within the labor force, inequality within the ability to construct culture. The aggregate effect of all those social trends is that groups develop collective identities. A really interesting sociological theory that I've read about, and I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure I buy it to its extreme, but it's called the linked fate argument. And what that says is because of the very unique history of African Americans in the United States, Blacks today have generally a belief that their ability, right, their advancement, your personal ability to live a good life, like to make advancements in society, is inexorably linked to the well-being of the Black population. And we do see some evidence that that's true. There's also some evidence that's been found that that might not be true, especially for young African Americans, right? Those born post after the Civil Rights era. I don't know, but that's what is meant generally by developed collective identity is. All right, moving on. Concept I want to engage with here to lead into the next lecture, right? Things I'm going to talk about at length on Wednesday. It's the idea of stratification. You'll remember when I started this lesson segment, we talked about stratification as being the way that people are divided in society. I will just be very upfront about this. We do not live in a post-racial society. A lot of people went on television after President Obama was elected and said, it's a post-racial society now. I would deeply, deeply question that. I think race is meaningful. I do think it's determinant of many things in our life. Actually, let me take that. It's not determinant of how our lives are going to turn out. It does strongly influence how our lives are going to turn out. So I want to start now by introducing a couple of concepts that are going to help us understand the material that comes next. Prejudice and discrimination. I know I've said this a million times. Two concepts that are often used interchangeably, but actually have a very meaningful sociological difference. Prejudice refers to holding negative preconceived ideas about a group. Now that sucks if somebody holds those beliefs about you, regardless of whatever it is that you've done to influence their belief of who you are as a person. What sociologists tend to care the most about, though, is discrimination. That is behavior that denies or limits resources to a member of a group that are attainable to others. It's kind of like a situation, if everybody is poor, then is anybody really poor, right? Like if you're being denied, sort of basic living standards, but that's happening to everybody, it's hard to feel like you're being singled out. But if you look at some of the data and you can see that some groups are doing very well in a certain area and other groups are facing roadblocks that do not exist for, say, the majority population, that's what is meant by discrimination. So an idea, like just to give you a very simple example of how this would work in practice, I previously did say that when we did gender the male perspective last time, I tried to make a joke about how, gentlemen, you should speak up right now because statistically speaking, college men are more likely to fail out of college than college women. So if I take that into my situation and I'm just like immediately looking out at the males in my classroom and saying, oh God, all right, look at all these men who are just not going to make it, then that is something that would be chalked up to prejudice. But if I then start to say something like, because of that, I am not going to let any men take any of my upper level classes, right? I'm not going to let them register for that. I refuse to teach men. I refuse to maybe hire men as research assistants. Then all of a sudden that's discriminatory because it's about a resource. It's about advancement. It's about access, okay? So here's the paradox. Here's where we're going to be going next. Attitudinal surveys are consistently showing that over the last 50 years, especially post Dr. King, post Civil Rights era, Americans are becoming just much more accepting and they are becoming much more tolerant of racial groups, right? We're more willing to have people in our neighborhoods. We're more willing to go to integrated schools. We're more willing to do various things that have friendships, relationships with people of a different race. That's all happening at the cultural level. But at the data level, at the empirical level, if I just look at the well-being of racial groups, I can see that there is serious racial inequality and ethnic inequality for that matter as well. So how do we explain the current state of inequality? The concept I'm going to begin my next lecture with is the concept of institutional discrimination. This is discrimination, which again is limiting resources and limiting access to those resources through the general operation of institutions themselves. I think this is a very powerful concept. I'll start this again with the definition the next time that we meet. But the last thing I'll say about this is prejudice is something like it comes out in people's speech, it comes out in the things that people say and write. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that stuff's meaningful, but it's also really easy. Like if somebody is racist, if somebody's being racist, it's really easy to recognize that. If an entire system or institution is racist or is creating racial inequality just through its very operations, that's a lot harder to put a stop to. That's a lot harder to alleviate. And people's lives are deeply affected by that. Okay, so I'm going to close this out here. I hope you enjoyed this. Like again, I'm at a loss. I'm sitting alone in my office and I'm kind of at a loss of how to actually end this lecture. But that wasn't so bad. I tried to go a little bit shorter since this is the first week, since this is the first time doing it. Tried to go a little bit shorter today than maybe I will in the future. But I encourage you, if you have feedback for me, please don't hesitate to send it along. You will get a new lecture posted on Wednesday. And that will just continue until we don't have to post lectures and listen to these videos anymore. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.